I'm Professor David Wilson. As a criminologist, I'm often asked, what's it like to interview a serial killer?
This is a tape-recorded interview. Date is 11/17/84.
In this new series, I'm going to take you on a journey into the dark heart of the police interrogation room. Using cutting-edge lip-sync technology, we'll bring to life the actual taped confessions of some of the world's most notorious murderers.
Put that pillowcase or whatever it looks like, cushion cover over her head.
And bring you face to face with evil.
Put her into the sleeping bag, and now I just slung her in the corner.
And along with forensic psychologist Professor Michael Brooks, I will analyse their interviews in unparalleled detail.
And while he was asleep, I put a noose around his neck. I throttled him with the noose, and he hardly struggled.
Like the police detectives who interviewed them, you'll experience firsthand their cold and calculating minds.
I've never gone with my mum. I knew that she favoured my sister more than me.
Their wicked words, now seen being spoken for the very first time, will never be forgotten.
The Hawkins girl's head was severed and taken up the road about 25 to 50 yards.
The conversations between a doctor and a patient, or a lawyer and a client, are confidential. But therein can lie a very challenging dilemma. What would happen if, for example, during a counselling session, a person seeking help confessed to a murder? In today's episode, we listen to the confession of a Canadian nurse, a self-styled angel of death, who used insulin to kill 8 elderly patients in Ontario care homes. A woman described by the judge in her trial not as an angel, but as a shadow of death, a shadow that passed over her victims. While still working as a nurse, she entered a drug rehabilitation program at a psychiatric hospital in Toronto after becoming hooked on painkillers stolen from pharmacies at the nursing homes where she worked. Whilst in counselling, she confessed to staff about killing and attempting to kill her patients. When the police were notified, she voluntarily agreed to be interviewed. With little prompting, she described the murders in detail, whilst claiming she was only doing God's bidding in ending these elderly lives. Who is this angel of death? Elizabeth Wettlaufer. On October 15th, 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer walked into a Toronto police station requesting to speak to detectives. Escorted to her seat by a police officer, she sat and waited quietly. No one would have expected that this mild-mannered nurse, a pillar of her local community, was about to reveal herself as being the most deadly female serial killer in Canadian criminal history. It would appear that the burden of her crimes and the fear that she would kill and kill again had become too much for her to bear.
Maybe somewhere there was a spark of conscience and she suddenly realised, I cannot go on doing this, and the only way I can absolve myself of any of these crimes is to come clean. And I think probably It became too much for her, and she had to tell somebody. She had to get it off her chest, and this is what she did, and this is what resulted in her obviously being questioned by the police and arrested.
As the tape recorder rolled, the church-going caregiver set the scene for detectives, describing a history of drug addiction and despair that had driven her to a dark and ultimately deadly place.
I told them that I had been killing people using an insulin overdose. And they all said, yes, you better go get help. So off I went.
It was almost as if when she went into that police station, it was as if she'd gone to confession, to admit her sins to her priest. But in this case, it was a police officer.
She knows they know what she's been up to. She's already confessed to it. So now she goes through the whole process as a kind of religious confession. And it's quite therapeutic for her. At the end, she sounds as if she's actually got some relief. I suspect she's had a sense of anger and frustration and irritation for a long time, and guilt. And here's an opportunity now to get emotional release from that.
You could have been in this situation and taken this to your grave.
Yes.
And who would have known? Right?
That's what I was told to do by a lawyer.
What's that?
Take it to my grave and not tell anybody.
In the most matter-of-fact voice, she starts to explain how she came to kill her victims, why it happened, why she believed she was right to do what she was doing, and it started to seem to the officers present that she didn't even see herself as having done anything that bad.
All serial killers develop a murder kit. It can be handcuffs, it can be rope, it can be all sorts of restraints. But in this Wettlaufer's kit, murder kit, was stuff that was readily available in the ward's medical cabinet. We think of Dr. Shipman, who was a drug addict. He was addicted to hydromorphine. He injected himself. You have Beverly Allett with access to drugs on a daily basis. Wettlaufer was no exception. She would have keys to a cabinet and she could inject the drugs into her patients, but on many occasions, as she admits in her own testimony, that she used some of that drugs intended for the patient to inject into herself.
Back at Meadow Park, what was your addiction?
Hydromorph.
Okay. All right.
Hydromorph.
Okay. And how much were you using?
I was a binge user, so I would use what I could get a hold of by stealing it from the patient.
It was her job at the old people's home where she worked to look after these old people and to make them comfortable and to ensure that the last few years of their lives were decent and manageable.
She would spend most of her duties looking after the infirm and the very ill, giving them medication, and caring to their general day-to-day needs. She would make sure that they were comfortable in bed, that they had everything they wanted. And these patients looked to her for love and support and care when they were estranged from their own families.
Wettlaufer had been a nurse for over 25 years and was well respected. But in 2007, her personal life began to disintegrate, and problems at home began to rear their head in the workplace.
When my ex and I broke up in 2007, I was already taking the medication for my borderline personality disorder. And I was so angry.
Serial killers claiming to have split personalities are not unusual. But I'm here with forensic psychologist Professor Michael Brooks to try and find out if there's any truth in Wettlaufer's claims.
I was already taking the medication for my borderline personality disorder.
Okay, Michael. Elizabeth Wettlaufer, a Canadian so-called angel of death. Let's deal with one of the things that crops up there immediately. She's described as having borderline personality disorder. What does that mean?
Very, very simply, it's the inability to control emotions.
Do you think it's significant that the first murder that she admits to comes in the same year that her marriage breaks up? Do you think there might be some connection to that?
There might well be a connection.
Again, though, the marriage breaks up, they don't have children from that marriage, and then she forms a relationship with another woman. A fluidity in her sexuality, does that give us any context for understanding her?
Is it a fluidity, or is it a confusion? Is she not certain whether her orientation is towards male or females? Why does she become more disturbed when her marriage breaks up? Why is it that she then goes on to kill? Why is it that she then has a relationship with a female if she hasn't had female relationships with females before? Normally with fluid sexuality, there'll be different relationships over a period of time. There won't necessarily just be one switch.
Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod.
Wettlaufer has it that God was instructing her to kill these elderly people. And this is a sort of bull, if you like, that so many killers come up with. Peter Sutcliffe came up with the same thing. He said he was visited by God when he was digging a grave in a cemetery. He had him in his cell, Harvey the Hammer Carrington. He said, God told me to kill people. Arthur Shawcross said God told him to kill prostitutes.
Religiosity is an aspect often of some serial killers. Being almost a religious fanatic, finding a deep faith and that reference to God's voice can either be a genuine attempt of her to minimize her personal culpability or something that she really doesn't believe but is in her psyche. But I think it's probably more the former. So I'm not entirely convinced about that as a kind of active contributory factor, but she certainly refers to it and repeats it and believes it to herself, and that makes it real in that sense.
And it was like a voice said inside me, I'll use you, don't worry about it. And the different times that I have caused people's deaths or caused them discomfort through the insulin, I believe it was the influence of that voice or whatever it was. It wasn't a voice in my head, it was a voice in here. And when I would do it, afterwards I would hear like a laughter in my chest.
She even talks about a red surge, that during those moments, God is telling her to kill her victims. And again, she makes it sound completely plausible. And she also manages to ensure that the responsibility for these killings is down to God, not down to her.
Well, we don't know whether she was high on the medication or whether she was suffering delusions. I mean, she talks about a red surge. She was a very angry woman. What comes across quite clearly is she's angry about life, angry about situations, and maybe this is her way of explaining her anger as a kind of surge, red mist almost, that men often talk about mist covering their eyes and they lose control. Maybe this is her way of explaining how she loses control of her emotions. But then she switches into this very controlling, very clear goal of killing people.
I think the most striking thing about the narrative that I've seen was that there are some pretty straightforward forms of defense mechanisms of rationalization and minimization and an attempt to place herself almost from a victim's perspective.
It could be suggested that she took her anger out on her victims. I'm not sure that that is completely true. I think it's more possible that she just enjoyed doing it for the fun of it. And she did it in a very cunning way because she injected these drugs in a manner that would let them die slowly. So she was out of the hospital, out of the premises quite often, and the patient would die 2 or 3 days later. So she was injecting these drugs in a way that was almost covering her tracks. So when the patient died, perhaps another nurse was on duty and she thought the responsibility would go to her. So she was injecting these drugs in a very, very careful and cunning way. But I don't know that I could say that she was angry to kill. She just wanted to kill.
So far during her confession, Wettlaufer has remained calm and cooperative. But already she's shoring up the fact that she wants the police to know she's a prescription drug addict. This is a classic ploy to start building up sympathy for herself and to lay the foundations that her addiction is a root cause behind her crime. And as the interview proceeds, while she maintains her outwardly demure composure, her facade begins to crack. She accuses her octogenarian male patients of sexually assaulting her, thereby, in her mind, making them fair game to be murdered.
So tell me a little bit about Maurice.
He was another one who liked to grab breasts and asses. He was sometimes a patient of mine. See, at that time, I didn't have a set floor that I worked on. I worked on all the different floors as a nurse, kind of filling in.
Okay.
So, one afternoon I was working with him and he did grab me. And again, I got that feeling inside that this is his time to go.
Wettlaufer was by now constructing a narrative wherein her elderly male patients were abusive towards her and therefore deserved to die. Yet, before long, it wouldn't just be Wettlaufer's male patients who were at risk. As a serial killer, her preferred victim group had become anyone who was geriatric.
It is pretty common knowledge that most serial killers have a preferred victim type. Beverly Alec went for much younger children in many cases. But this woman, Wettlaufer, she had a ready supply of victims literally laying in their beds waiting for her to come along and kill them. And you cannot imagine again that some of these elderly people, some were in their 80s, still had good life left in them, although they were sick. They still look forward to seeing their grandchildren once a week, or their younger children come in to visit them for Easter or birthday presents. They still had life left in them. Yet this woman, Wettlaufer, who really was just a lonely, sad drug addict with a split personality, decided that she would take all that away from those children and remove their lives. And she didn't have to go trawling the streets like serial killers do for a victim. She didn't have to go and find prostitutes on the street corner. She had them laying them in front of her.
Serial killers, especially those within the medical profession, seem to hone in to the older patients, the elderly who perhaps don't have many people visiting them, who perhaps are sickly, not necessarily close to death. But then people like Elizabeth and Shipman, for example, they start to feel that it's their duty, or almost they're doing these patients a favour by ending their life before their lives become more painful, as if they are God.
One of the great things about being a serial killer is power and control. Serial killers love to be in a powerful position. Now, she was a nurse, she was administrating medication appropriately, but she was also giving it inappropriately. She was controlling, she was playing God. I mean, that's what she enjoyed doing. That's what all serial killers enjoy. That moment when they decide you live or you don't live. That is a fantastic turn on for anybody who's into that kind of behaviour.
We can't ignore, Michael, the reality that a surprising proportion of serial killers in the world have a healthcare background. What is it about that context of working in hospitals or nursing homes, or indeed as a GP in the community, that affords serial killers the opportunities?
In many situations, you have to ask, why is somebody applying for a particular post? What's their attraction? So if you look at teaching as a profession, it will draw in those who are attracted to children. And usually they're those who will go out of the way. Everybody will think they're an excellent teacher. They will volunteer for additional activities. That then gives them the opportunity to offend, because they will have children by themselves with very little other adults around. You have to ask, why do these individuals go into healthcare? Is the healthcare environment providing them with the victims that they're seeking?
And of course, there's access to drugs. That access to drugs, people die, sadly people die in the hospitals, so therefore it's not commented upon. So there might be a variety of things within a healthcare setting that serial killers could use to their own advantage.
To cover up their offences, to cover up their crimes.
The one thing about the medical setup is that you do often have access to drugs, so you can kill people quite easily. You have people who actually adore you. You have patients who actually think the nurses are wonderful and the doctors are wonderful. And we actually have a situation where in one case, the family actually thanked her for looking after the patient. And that reminded me very much of Beverly Arlett, where she was actually made a godmother to one of the surviving twins, having killed the other twin. So patients have this idea that nurses are wonderful and can't do any harm.
She would not have been a serial killer if she had not been in that position, that place of trust, that place of opportunity, and that place of the vulnerability of the victims that allowed her, and her knowledge, her professional knowledge as well.
As a trained nurse, obviously she knew how to give an injection. And so she would go to the medical cabinet, perhaps on occasions unauthorized. She would fill her syringe with more than the correct dose and inject it into the patient. And that person, when they closed their eyes and went to sleep, the last thing they would see were the loving, caring eyes of Wettlaufer looking down on them and fluffing up their pillows before they went to bed.
She did what we recognise is probably the best way to kill in a hospital, is the use of insulin, because it's so easy to get hold of. You can give a patient insulin and you can cause death that way. Now, what was interesting about her, she didn't do the Beverly Arlett of dashing in and saving patients. She just killed patients, didn't want to be the heroine or the hero. She actually just killed people because she wanted to kill them.
So tell me a little bit about Maurice.
He was another one who liked to grab breasts and asses. One afternoon I was working with him and he did grab me. And again, I got that feeling inside that this is his time to go. So I gave him an overdose of insulin after supper. And I believe he died the next day.
And how did it make you feel when Maurice passed away?
Not good.
Once they commit the crime, they may find that, and this is probably crucial, that it was a pleasurable experience, however perverse that might sound, that there was some pleasure derived from it, whether it was the power element or whether it was a release of stress element or any kind of vindictive justification. But there's another element to it as well, which I think is they get away with it. And that is a huge relief, and also kind of unlocks the key, and I can do this again. I may even be able to do it with impunity if, I will hone these skills on a rational level. So I think it's those two things fundamentally. It's kind of the pleasure response. We're more likely to do something again if we enjoyed it. It's as simple as that.
One afternoon I was working with him and he did grab me. Again, I got that feeling inside that this is his time to go.
As the interview progresses, it becomes clear that Wettlaufer views her male and female patients differently. The men are almost universally abusive and abusers. The women are, by and large, being put out of their misery. And in doing so, she's determined to paint herself as a martyr to their pain and as a cleanser of evil.
Helen was miserable. She frequently yelled out, "Help me, nurse." She frequently yelled out she wanted to die. She just was not happy with her life. She would wheel around in her wheelchair saying, "Help me, nurse, help me, nurse, help me, nurse, help me, nurse." And when you went to help her, what do you want help with? Nothing. Get away with me. Go away. Help me, nurse, help me, nurse. Didn't want to eat, didn't want to drink. Very difficult to deal with. Constantly would yell, or we'd say, "What do you want help with?" "I want to die. Why can't you help me die? I want to die."
Often you find males in the 1780s, they're starting to dement, they start to behave socially inappropriately, they often end up being sexually inappropriate. So nurses will tell you that with elderly gentlemen, that they do grab their breasts, they do grab the bottoms, they do actually sexually become active. And some of them even masturbate in front of them because their frontal lobe doesn't inhibit them, which it should do in normal situations. So they become disinhibited, and that goes sexually as well as language. Often you find vicars starting to swear and things like that. Now, with our ladies, they tend to be more respectful of nurses, and in this case, quite clearly, she saw them as being on their way to heaven. She wanted them to go quietly and peacefully. She actually saw herself, in some sense, of actually helping them on their way to death.
And one night, it was like something snapped inside, and that red Starch came back, and I thought, okay, you will die. So I gave her a shot. I came up to her and said, "This is for your pain," and I gave her a shot.
Wettlaufer's admissions to police are multifaceted and multi-leveled, and I think we have to look again behind the words and read between the lines of what she's saying. She certainly differentiates between how the men treated her and the females treated her. She sort of almost blames the man for grabbing her or screaming and shouting at her. But the women she treats completely differently. And to get inside her head's a very difficult thing. but it's almost like she's got a motherly instinct towards the elderly woman, and there's some sort of bitterness against the man for some reason, which may have been in her history, it might have been something to do with her marriage, we don't know. But what we do know is that she came from being married to a guy, and then she became a lesbian. And it was perhaps that lesbian instinct, that female instinct, that made her think slightly differently the way she treated the female patients rather than the man. But that's pure speculation.
One afternoon I was working with him and he did grab me. And again, I got that feeling inside that this is his time to go.
Do you think the fact that she has a rationale for herself as to why she's killing her male patients, and that rationale is different to the rationale she has for herself in relation to killing her female patients, has any sense whatsoever? Or is this simply a construction that she gives post-arrest?
See, I wouldn't use the word rationale, I'd use the word justification.
Why?
So she provides a justification to herself for why she's killing male patients, which she couldn't apply to female patients. So she needs another justification for killing female patients, and the justification is to ease the pain.
I think for me it's helpful to say that there are two aspects of a conscience. There's a personal conscience, that one that you acquire, which is basically saying, I'm a good person, and this is something I wouldn't do, there are boundaries to my behavior. And then there's a social conscience as well, which is the one where you're the public voice. What would people think of me if I did this? And I think when she tries to do this process is one of trying to salve both aspects of that conscience. She's probably rehearsing what the public would think of her. She doesn't want to be thought of as a monster.
One night she said, I'm going to die tonight.
Mary said that?
Yeah. And I said, oh. And she said, yeah, why don't you get me into the deathbed so I can die? And I said, are you sure? And she said, yeah, put me to bed, I'm going to die. So I said, okay, and I went to the other nurse that was working with me, and she said, oh, okay, well, let's put her inside the scare room if that's what you want. So we did, and then I thought, well, she must be the next one. I had a feeling inside of me she must be the next one, because she was saying she was going to die, but there's no signs she was going to die. So I gave her an overdose of insulin. She became palliative and she died. I think it's been a couple of days.
It's a rather frightening conclusion that she is not that exceptional, and that there are many other people with similar profiles. And what she did is understandable. It's not excusable, but what she did is understandable in terms of that kind of almost mercy-killing aspect for her.
The different times that I have caused people's deaths or caused them discomfort through the insulin, I believe it was the influence of that voice or whatever it was. It wasn't a voice in my head, it was a voice in here.
In my experience of working with violent men and women, those that choose to end the lives of the sick and the vulnerable in care homes and hospitals often do it because it allows them to play God, to decide who should live and who should die. There's rarely any sexual motive. It's merely the ultimate display of power to end a life when they choose. Had Elizabeth Wettlaufer not turned herself into the authorities, it's almost certain she would have continued to kill undetected for a long, long time. The trust patients place in those who care for them remains amongst the greatest acts of faith known. And so it's this betrayal that makes this one of our worst crimes.
This confession is fascinating also because most people within the medical profession who commit these sort of heinous crimes do not explain why they do it. They don't explain how they do it. It's almost as if they have a godlike persona about them and just believe they have the right to do it. But in the case of Elizabeth, she sat there and explained it all in intricate detail. You even get an insight into how her mind is working at the time. And this makes it all the more chilling.
Her confessions to the police, it is almost like she's confessing to God. It's almost as if she's gone to church and asked for forgiveness. That's the way she's talking to the police officer. And the police officer has done a remarkable job of working with her through that period of absolution, if you will.
If I think about serial killers falling into two distinct groups, the ones who are garrulous and talkative, but the vast majority of whom are silent and uncommunicative. Why does she want to talk as much about what she's done?
Because she wants to draw attention to herself. She wants the publicity. She wants the airtime. She wants you to listen to what she has to say. This is a very extensive interview that she gave. So she likes sort of the sound of her own voice. She likes to dominate proceedings. She likes to be able to share with others her thoughts and her views and her experiences. But that doesn't mean to say that in any way that what she's saying is actually the case.
It is said that most serial killers are psychopaths. And a psychopath has no conscience. In fact, where there should be a conscience, there's a black hole. And it is very difficult for the viewer or anybody else to understand what that means, what it means you have no empathy towards anybody else at all. It is almost impossible for the normal person in the street to understand how cold-blooded these people are. So when they start confessing to their crimes, they do so because it's a normal thing to do. It means nothing to them. They're not feeling any empathy towards their victims whatsoever. They will sit and talk to you about it as if they were just playing a game of bowls. It does not matter to them. It doesn't matter that they cause suffering and pain. If they cry, they're crying for themselves, their own predicament they're in. This nurse went through her confession in a calm, peaceful, logical way. And this is why she's quite interesting, because if she was a true-blooded psychopath who didn't care, why did she turn herself in? A psychopath, a serial killer, doesn't do that. He's got no conscience, he doesn't care. So maybe somewhere in this woman, although she killed these people with the thought of putting them out of their misery perhaps, or ending their days peacefully with no suffering, perhaps she's a bit of an enigma. Perhaps she's not a psychopath after all.
How did your emotions start to feel as it kept continuing?
I kept having a lot of guilt. A lot of guilt.
In another twist to the killer nurse's story, she would claim to be overwhelmed by guilt for her crimes, not an emotion commonly found in serial killers.
I felt horrible. I felt angry at myself. I felt like I had failed myself. I felt like God had failed me.
Did you continue to practice in the church?
I continued going to church, yes. I was trying very, very hard to get close to God, to make sure that this wasn't Him, and to just live my life, read the Bible, go to church, and not do that because I didn't want to do it anymore. So I tried very hard. I'm still using a little bit.
What's unusual with her was that there was a gap for about 2 years where she wasn't working with the elderly, so she didn't kill. And she didn't seem to have any driving motivation to kill during that period. And then when she went back to working with the elderly, she went back to killing.
In June 2017, Wettlaufer was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of 8 elderly patients. With no chance of parole for at least 25 years, Wettlaufer will be 76 years old when she gets out, the same age as some of the patients that she murdered.
There was always that red surging that I identified as God telling me, this is what, and this is how you work for me.
Do you pick up some psychosis in what we've heard? A disordered thinking? She talks about voices, for example, quite a lot.
Well, that would be the link. If there is any form of psychosis, would be the hearing of the voices, but that's not connected with personality disorder, and sometimes people get confused around that. So you can have personality disorder, you can have mental disorder, and you can have mental illnesses. So sort of hearing voices would fall more into the category of a mental illness than a personality disorder or a mental disorder.
The different times that I have caused people's deaths or caused them discomfort through the insulin, I believe it was the influence of that voice or whatever it was. It wasn't a voice in my head, it was a voice in here.
Can we hold her responsible for what she did? Or do you think her responsibility is diminished as a consequence of the background that she has in terms of mental health?
Unless a psychiatrist makes a decision that she is not responsible for her actions, then she is responsible. So I would say in this situation that she hasn't been diagnosed by a psychiatrist as having a sort of a mental illness, and therefore she's responsible for her actions. She's also able to function as a nurse and carry out her actions as a nurse, whilst at the same time committing these offences. So to all extents and purposes, she seems to be functioning well, or at least not to the level to be put on a disciplinary charge for underperforming or for doing anything that she shouldn't be doing. So therefore I think you have to say that she is responsible for her actions.
I think she was a kind of marginalized, inadequate woman who was embittered probably by a life of relative failure and frustration. There was, again, that religious element to her, which I think introduced God into the equation critically. I think she was relatively stable. She had come to a point where probably that sense of power and control for someone who had had so little power and control in their life, and I would speculate again that she had experienced a sequences of rejection, which left her with pretty low self-esteem. This would raise her self-esteem, that sense of having the power of life and death.
And one night it was like something snapped inside, and that red surge came back, and I thought, okay, you will die.
Elizabeth, Shipman, other members of the medical profession who became serial killers have the ultimate power in their hands. And because they work within the medical profession, they are able to make those split-second decisions in a way that other killers cannot. And they also believe they're going to get away with it because they believe that they have the right to do it in certain ways. And this was certainly the case with Elizabeth. These interviews offer an extraordinary insight into the mechanisms of how a member of the medical profession can murder with ease. And for that reason, they are unique and also extremely frightening to listen to.